Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And we have a returning guest who you cannot fail to recognize. We have the amazing Simon Southerton with us today. How are you, Simon?
I'm very good, Rebecca. How are you?
We're great. And we'd love to podcast with you. There is a time difference between all of us. Like it goes over a couple days. So we kind of have to coordinate, don't we? I'm like, it's Wednesday night for us. Right. It's Thursday morning for you. It's amazing we can even get together, but it's really important. So I'm glad we do. Yep, it's awesome. Yeah. So
it's good to see you, Landon.
Yeah, you as well. I'm really excited about this. I really like our scientific episodes, and DNA is one of those that just keeps coming back up. That everyone keeps saying. At least the apologists want to keep making an argument that no, just because we haven't found it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So.
Pay no attention, right, to the DNA.
Right.
No, and this is why we asked Simon on, because I've seen increasing chatter about DNA. You know, they're saying there's new information, new evidence that, you know, backs up Book of Mormon claims. And I've been seeing TikToks and shorts, don't worry about DNA. And I came across one of Simon's responses, posts, and I thought, okay, it's time. We need to have a discussion about this. So this is, and I reached out and he graciously said, sure. So we are going to talk about DNA today and the Book of Mormon. So thank you so much for coming on.
Okay, I think I've pulled up the slides here.
You disappear, Landon.
Awesome slides.
Gets a little technical when you start talking DNA. So
it does. It does. Everybody hang in there.
Maybe what sort of spurred some of the chatter on these groups is that I think it was about a year ago, I basically posted on Reddit that the DNA essay is pretty much outdated because there's been a huge shift in the scientific community over the last 15 years from working on mitochondrial DNA, which we'll talk about in a moment, and shifting to nuclear DNA. And nuclear DNA is just a much more powerful technology that's routinely used all over the world to study human populations. And nuclear DNA is not even mentioned in the essay. The essay is pretty much focused on mitochondrial DNA, which is quite an old technology in many respects.
So the essay is what, 10 years old? So that's 10 years old technology. A lot of advances have been made. And that's your argument is it's now even more evident what the DNA is telling us than it was 10 years ago.
Yeah, the essay is pretty heavily focused on things like genetic drift and bottleneck effect, which are to do with the loss of DNA and explain away why you may not be seeing DNA, because we obviously haven't seen any sign of Hebrew DNA that's arrived in the Americas within the last, 2,000 or 3,000 years. So that's the sort of stuff that the essay was focused on, because those, biological phenomena that result in the loss of DNA lineages are more, mitochondrial DNA is more prone to being lost through extinction than genomic DNA. Genomic DNA tends to preserve an awful lot of genetic information. It seems to stay in populations for very long times. So, but the main thing is that the essay is really addressing the older technology. And so I raised that about a year ago. And as you said, it's been 10 years since the essay was written. So it needs a bit of an update and a refresh to explain away the problematic data that's arrived in the last 15 years.
Yeah, and you're the one to do it. No doubt about that. Absolutely.
Well, where do you want me to start?
Let's start with your first slide. Let's
okay.
Dive right in. We're just talking about the idea that, DNA and the remnants that should be there in populations today to show that, the origins were where they say they were. It really isn't there, no matter how much you spin it, right? No matter how much the apologists try to spin it, it just doesn't exist.
Yeah, I think it's always useful to go back and look at a little bit of scripture and look at the sort of things that the early prophets of the church, including Joseph Smith, the sort of things that they said. So, I mean, it's if you just do a plain reading of the Book of Mormon, if you look at that first slide on the Promised Land, I'm seeing a slide there that says Scripture and Prophets. I'm not sure what's...
Landon will switch it in a minute, I think.
Yep, I can switch that.
There you go.
Okay. Yeah, so it's the Book of Mormon's really quite clear that Lehi and his family, when they migrated away from Jerusalem, were going to a land kept from the knowledge of other nations, and it was to be a place for their inheritance. Pretty much the same message to the Jaredites in 2000 BC, that they were going into a quarter where there never had man been, and it was a land preserved for righteous people. So everything about the Book of Mormon gives the appearance that the people leaving the Middle East were going to a promised land, a land preserved for them and kept for them by the Lord. And when they arrive in the New World, they make absolutely no mention of the fact that the land was teeming with other people, as it was. The Americas were widely and heavily populated, and have been for 15,000 years, 14,000 years. Even South America has been colonized for about 14,000 years. So the scriptures really indicate that it was a vacant or the land preserved for them, and it gives no indication of other non-old world populations that were living there. So if you go on to the next slide, you can even...
The title page, or the original title page, basically said that, that it was preserved for them, and that they were they were the progenitors of the Native Americans. And since that time, they've had to change that. And that change clearly came from the DNA results, because the DNA results made it obvious that there'd been no DNA found for any of these peoples, that it was Asia in nature, which forced the church to have to make that claim. So it's really kind of a twofer here, because first they said, no one was in the land, and then all of a sudden the DNA doesn't show it. Now they all of a sudden say, oh no, the land was completely covered by people. They just came as a small group and kind of integrated with that culture. And that's the story they've had to go with, because of the fact that the DNA is clearly showing that Native Americans came from Asia over a land bridge or along the seacoast, and not from the Hebrews. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Well, the apologists claim that the introduction to the Book of Mormon was written by so and so. I can't remember. It was written by a church leader, I think, and it was never official and whatnot. But they didn't bother to do anything about this until the DNA came along. So the DNA prompted them. They just basically are claiming that, oh look, it was not official and it was outdated anyway, and they just updated it. But it's been a continuous story of retreat in the apologetic circles from a time when it was widely accepted. Certainly when I left the church in 1998, it was widely accepted in the church that the Lamanites were everywhere. All of Native Americans were Lamanites, descended from the Book of Mormon people.
Yeah, all North Americans, South Americans, Polynesians, everybody was.
And Polynesians.
Yeah.
No, there was no question. If you were raised in the 60s, 70s, 80s church, there was no question. Yeah, the Lamanites, they were the descendants.
And that still goes on in Polynesia now.
Oh.
Polynesian Mormons are reassured that they're descended from Lehi, the House of Israel. Yeah, so... so I think it's useful to remind these people, the apologists and those who are twisting scripture to make it fit with the science, some of the things that are in the scriptures and some of the things that Joseph Smith said. Okay, so in Joseph Smith's own history, he said he was also informed concerning the Aboriginal inhabitants of this country and shown who they were and from whence they came. He talked about, this is revelations from God in the Doctrine and Covenants that talk about the Lamanites. So people were sent on missions to the land of the Lamanites, or the land of Missouri, into the borders of the Lamanites. And that was frequent. There are many references in the Doctrine and Covenants where God is, as he's talking to Joseph Smith, is referring to the American Indians in North America as Lamanites. So what's going on here? We've got God referring to the Native Americans as Lamanites, but they don't have any Jewish DNA at all. So,
well, and it's not just a Mormon idea. We did an episode that aired last night where we went over, just in the basic concept in the country of that time. It was, mound builders couldn't possibly be Native Americans we see now. There must have been a superior group trying to link it to the Israelites. And so this was an idea that was everywhere. It's not unique to Mormonism, nor is it unique to Joseph Smith. And a lot of people don't realize that. This is what everybody believed. Joseph Smith just kind of created fantasy fiction that put that, into motion and kind of put that together. So, but it was everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, so let's dive into the DNA. I don't want to overwhelm you with sort of too much information, but the key things are that there are two very important types of DNA that we all carry in each of our cells. So every cell in our body has a complete copy of our nuclear DNA. So when you hear people talking about genome, the whole human genome, that's the 3 billion base pairs of DNA that's carried in the nucleus of every cell that we in our body. So that contains all of our genes encoded into that DNA, and it's organized in chromosomes. You can see there the chromosomes on the left-hand side. Now there's outside of the nucleus is what's called our mitochondrial DNA. And the mitochondrial DNA that we all have comes from our mothers. It's maternally inherited. And that's because if you can imagine when an egg is fertilized by the sperm, so you can sort of imagine it with that cell there, the sperm penetrates the nucleus and deposits the male DNA in the center of the into the nucleus, but the mitochondria that are associated with the sperm degenerate and they don't get transferred into the egg. So it's only the mitochondrial DNA of the mother that then goes on to produce the zygote and the developing organism. In the human case, the baby. So those two types of DNA, they have slightly different patterns of inheritance. Our genomic or the nuclear DNA that we all carry comes from both of our parents, but the mitochondrial DNA we carry comes from our mothers. Okay. Now, the mitochondrial DNA was studied first by scientists because sequencing DNA was really tough initially. Like 30 years ago, it was very, very difficult. It took a lot of work to sequence 1,000 or 2,000 base pairs of DNA. In fact, I've been in labs where I've done DNA sequencing of genes, a gene that was about 1,500 base pairs long. And that took several weeks to a month to sequence one gene. Now, the technology is so advanced they can sequence the entire genome, 3 billion base pairs of an individual overnight for probably only a few $100, possibly even less. I'm not even sure what the latest cost is. So, that gives you an idea of the escalation in the amount of genetic information that scientists are now working with. So, but mitochondrial DNA was the first DNA that scientists started to use when they were comparing populations. And that's because if you look at it, it's only 16,500 base pairs long. So to sequence the first mitochondrial DNA, which happened back in 1980 or 81, that would have taken a couple of months of work to get 16,500 base pairs sequenced. But now they can sequence it in no time, probably in half an hour. So it's very, very, very easy. Really, the scientists these days are spoiled.
Is this the process used? Like, I did 23andMe, right? I spit into a tube, I sent it in, they sent it back, and they told me I had a large percentage of Neanderthal DNA, like everybody who has Germanic roots.
No, I think you're exaggerating the percentage. It's not large. It's probably 2%.
Right. Large compared to what other people have. Yeah. Just like a two. Yeah. Not large, like 75%. No, not like that. But it was funny because
probably closer to 3% or something like that.
Exactly.
I think I'm about 1.8 or something.
Yeah, it said on the results, you have, yours is higher, than a lot that they see. But it's funny because I told my parents that, and my dad said, both faithful LDS, well, Neanderthal, that's not really a thing, is it? Well, and he's a scientist, shocking. And my mom said, oh, that must be on your father's side. That kind of result showing up definitely causes some problems, I think, with the LDS, mindset and narrative, but it's real. It's there.
Yeah,
this was the process. When I sent that in, they would have done this to it to see who I am.
So initially, these family history places were just doing mitochondrial DNA, but they all now do the nuclear DNA. And they don't sequence your entire genome. What they do is they have technology that looks at about 500,000 or 700,000 places in the nuclear DNA, all along your chromosomes, about 500 or 600,000 points that are informative. They're points that differ between populations, and so they can then build up a picture of where your ancestors come from. And it can be very surprisingly accurate, that information. It can tell. I know that with Europeans, so in the UK, I've got ancestors that come from Cornwall and from Devon. And there was a study in the UK where they were able to distinguish very clearly between people who had predominantly Devon ancestry as opposed to Cornish ancestry. And those two counties are divided by a river.
Oh.
So they're very close.
Those
people look the same, identical, but DNA can actually distinguish them. And that's because those populations have been separated for a few thousand years largely, and they accumulate new mutations, which help scientists to distinguish them. So if you look on the next slide, this is really the information that comes that scientists are interested in when they're looking at mitochondrial DNA and nuclear DNA. So they're often called mutations, but they're not really. Mutation sort of is a bit of a loaded word and implies that it doesn't work properly or it's messed up. But the human genome, the nuclear DNA and our mitochondrial DNA, through history, people, when they pass it on to their offspring, their machinery for copying the DNA will introduce new spelling changes. And these are often just referred to as DNA markers. But they can be deleterious, they can be harmful, but for the most part, they're not. But they're also they can also pass on a benefit. An example of that is that some of the genes that Neanderthals carry are beneficial in some populations. So in some populations, they have much higher levels of a particular gene. I think in Mongolia, people where they live at altitude have a gene which came to them from Neanderthals, because it helps them to live at higher altitude and absorb more oxygen from their blood. So if you look in mitochondria, they carry, if we were to compare our mitochondria, the three of us, we might have 20 or 30 differences. So there's not a lot of mistake. There's not a lot of differences between the 16,500. Most of them are identical, but those 20 to 30 differences have enabled scientists to classify all of the mitochondria that humans have into this big family tree. And you would have heard that Native Americans, for example, they carry the A, B, C, D, or X lineage, mitochondrial lineage, and that's just families of lineages that are related to each other, carry the same mutations or DNA markers. They're grouped together.
So would you be part of multiples of these, or you're either A, you're B, you're C, or you could belong to groups?
No, you would, in virtually all cases, you would carry a single lineage. Okay, so Native Americans, there's a certain proportion, it might be about 35% that are A, 30% that are B. But they don't carry both.
So what does that tell us if you're A or B? I mean, they're both Native Americans. They've been here. Does that mean they separated tens of thousands of years ago from whatever group that initially came, or does that mean it's six different groups somehow made it to America? What does that tell us? That if you're
no, with mitochondrial DNA, all of those, the A, B, C, and D lineage have a direct ancestral lineage in Asia. Okay, so they descend from an A, B, C, and D lineage in Asia. The X lineage is rare in the Americas. It only occurs in North America, and only at about 2 or 3%. And they haven't done enough sequencing in Asia to identify it. It hasn't been picked up in Asia yet. It could be there, but it may not be there. It's possible that it arose. It was just a very low frequency. Well, we know it's a low frequency in the Americas. It's only a couple of percent. It may have been a very rare lineage in Asia, and it's gone up in frequency because an X lineage person snuck across the land bridge. And this is basically going back to the essay, the DNA essay, the founder effect. It can distort or change the frequency of particular lineages. So I suspect that the X lineage might have been at a much lower frequency in Asia, and we just see a larger frequency of it in the Americas because that individual was, an ancestor carrying that lineage was lucky to get through, and their population has survived. But having said that, not nearly as much sequencing of people has taken place in Asia as what's going on in the Americas. So
it seems to me that X is the one that the apologists like to hang on. That's Semitic DNA. I keep hearing, oh yeah, that's Semitic DNA.
No, that's false. That's been disproven over and over and over again. It may have traced its ancestry back to the Middle East, but it's ancestry that goes back 35,000 years.
Not 600 BC.
Yeah. Yeah. So the X lineage is a very, very large, and it's an ancient group. So you can sort of think of it as a low branch on the tree that goes a long way back in human history. And so the X lineage is found all over Europe, but at very low frequencies. And yes, it's found in the Middle East, but there's nothing remarkable about the Middle East.
But so the DNA itself is,
and I'll talk about the X lineage clearly later on, because I've got a slide that addresses the false claims that David Reed, who's a Heartland Rodney Meldrum apologist with no scientific training, I will explain in detail where he's got that wrong with the X lineage.
But what I'm hearing you say though is and not directly, but the DNA isn't only a problem for the Nephites, it's a problem for the Noah's Ark story. It's a problem for the Adam and Eve story because it's going back 36,000 years. And we know in our scriptures, that 6,000 years is what Joseph Smith in the Doctrine and Covenants says was the length of the human existence. So DNA is not just problematic for the Book of Mormon. It seems to be problematic all the way back. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say. Yeah, and it's important for people to know that quite a few Mormon apologists and Mormon scientists are well aware that human ancestry goes back a long, long way, and they fully accept that we have ancestry that's from Neanderthals and Denisovans because it's unambiguous. It's a fact. It's not an opinion. It's a fact. We have Neanderthal DNA. We have Denisovan DNA, and it's a fact that American Indians have lived in the Americas for over 20,000 years. So yes, but there are many Mormons, Mormons with scientific training that don't believe that there was a global flood, and they don't believe there was a Garden of Eden 6,000 years ago. So, DNA pretty much refutes the idea that we all descend from Adam and Eve who lived 6,000 years ago. That's simply not true. It's not possible for the amount of genetic diversity that we have in the human population to have been jammed through a bottleneck to people 6,000 years ago. Just not possible.
And yet in conference, we hear, Mother Eve, Father Adam, we hear these stories, that they're still using. I know some people think, okay, I'll just consider it an allegory, but there's a lot of, you have to take it literally to make everything else work kind of. But now they're starting to talk about pre-Adamites. There's some books coming out on evolution and how does that fit. Yeah. So people are starting to explore it and recognize it can't be allegorical. It has to be real. It's not real. So what do we do now? That's why this is so fascinating.
Yeah, it's very problematic trying to merge it all together when you start talking about, God's chosen people having God's chosen DNA and then pre-Adamites and all that sort of stuff. You're really walking a tightrope, a racist tightrope, and there are no simple explanations.
When you say racist, even the blacks and the priesthood issue, from what I read, the DNA shows that there is no Adam and Eve, but the most ancient humans were black in color. So to say that Adam had the Melchizedek priesthood, yet God wouldn't allow them to have the priesthood is a ridiculous argument, because the DNA shows that the earliest humans were out of Africa and would have been dark skinned.
Well, the DNA is now aligning, fairly closely with the archaeological record. I mean, scientists have been sort of, we do. I think the archaeological evidence, is that humans emerged in Africa approximately 200,000 years ago, and the DNA evidence fits fairly well with that. Having said that, there wasn't a recent bottleneck. Scientists have found evidence for there being ancient bottlenecks. So there were times when the human population was fairly small, and that's not uncommon for lots and lots of species. They have huge booms in their populations, and they have times when they have mass extinction events, and they can get down to very small populations, but then they rebound. So humans have been through bottlenecks, but those will go back a long, long way. But I don't believe there's any evidence that there was a bottleneck so tight that it was just two individuals. It was more than likely a population of a few thousand I think there are papers where scientists have attempted to estimate what those sort of numbers are.
Yeah, the numbers I've heard
Yeah,
was
the
like
DNA's created more problems than
1200
just
kind
the
of.
Book of Mormon. It's not.
Yeah.
It's for any of the other claims. I mean, before DNA came along, in the weeks before I discovered I stumbled on the DNA research papers. I was grappling with, Noah's flood, and for many years, and I'd realised it just couldn't have happened. I just couldn't see, based on the DNA evidence from the plant field, that there was just no sign of a massive extinction event, or that would have wiped out huge numbers of plants, and that would leave such a dramatic
marker.
scar.
Yeah. It would be
in the
known.
record.
It would be well known. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. Science, it's clear cut. It's there. To me, it's not disputable. However, in these new books that and essays are coming out about evolution, they're saying they say science and Mormonism, God, are completely compatible. If there's ever a time where they seem incompatible, it's because you misunderstood God's word through the prophet, some of those statements from the past, or you're misunderstanding science. So, that's what they're saying. They're saying they're completely compatible. And yet here we have this. So I'm not quite sure if you really dive in how you can be on board with that.
Yeah. And this isn't an evil agenda that the scientific community is on. Science, and that was one of the things that appealed to me when I did science, is just the search for knowledge, just to discover new things. And we're just seeing the products of scientists doing a lot of hard work over many years and being curious and not accepting the simple explanation that in the beginning God created man and woman. So anyway, if we march on that slide, we talked about the mitochondrial DNA having 20 to 30 markers. Well, the nuclear DNA carries millions of markers, literally millions. In fact, there was a paper published only a couple of weeks ago where they examined the DNA of about 350 Native Americans from Central America and South American populations. So 350 individuals where they sequenced the entire genome of every one of them. So they had 3 billion base pairs of genetic information from each one of those 350 people. And they compared that to the DNA of other populations in the world, particularly in Asia. And they found no sign of any ancient Hebrew DNA cropping up in those populations. But scientists can now distinguish very clearly between different Native American populations. So people are the Zapotec Indians of Mexico compared to the Mayan Native Americans from Guatemala or the Yucatan Peninsula. They can distinguish those two groups quite clearly from their DNA. And that's because you have this enormous resource of information. So that those 3 billion, what the scientists found with those 350 South and Central American Indians was that there were 50 million positions in their genomes where they had DNA markers that could be used to distinguish them from other populations around the world. 50 million. So there's enormous amounts of information. Compare that with the 20 or 30 markers that they have in the mitochondrial genome, going back 30 years. That's the sort of information level that they have these days. So it's profound. But let's just quickly run through the data that scientists have come up with on Native American populations. And if you flick to the first slide, in the Americas. So this is data that came out of a paper that was published, when was it, 2021? And prior to this, I was so grateful for this paper to be published, because before this came along, I was the only person in the world, I felt like, who had gone to this length to bring all the data together and to summarize the data on Native American populations. So
right,
it's good to see an unbiased scientist
pioneer in
with
the
no axe
field.
to grind. It's got no axe to grind with the Mormon Church, has published the data. So 500 populations have now been sampled. 22. This is mitochondrial DNA information we're looking at. 22,500 modern people were tested, but over 3,500 ancient remains have now been DNA tested. And of the modern people, 99% of them have an Asian origin, and 1% have either European or African mitochondrial DNA. And that's not surprising, considering the amount of admixture that's come into the Americas since Columbus. I'm surprised that's that low, but I think the reason for that is the scientists generally, when they do their studies, have excluded people that have mixed ancestry. So if somebody knows that they've got an African in their ancestry family tree or Europeans, then they would have been excluded from the study. So, but you're always going to get a few that slip through, because they don't. It's been 20 generations or 15 generations since Columbus arrived, so there will be some that have European or Africans sneaking in there in the past. So you can see that there's a very high proportion of Asian mitochondrial DNA lineages there. When scientists look at the ancient samples, 100% Asian. So 3,628 ancient samples, and they're all derived from Asia. They've also been able to determine when they arrived. So for each of the A, B, C, D, and X lineage families, they've now sequenced. They've now got the full mitochondrial DNA genome of dozens of individuals. So dozens of people that have an A, dozens that have a B. And so within each of those mitochondrial families, they count up the mutations, and they can work out how long ago they had that single ancestor in Asia. And so when they do that for the A, B, C, D, and X lineage, and Hugo Perego, who wrote the DNA essay, published a paper on this, and so he's found that, and other scientists have found similar evidence that the mitochondrial DNA dates back to about 17,000 years ago. So to the Asian, so the 17,000 years ago, they had a sort of a common ancestor for the A, B, C, D, and X.
Well, that's really telling, that 100% Asian for ancient samples, meaning nobody that was here pre-Columbus had anything other than Asian DNA is what they found.
Yeah, there's no evidence to suggest any other source for Native American DNA. Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more about that indeed when we talk about the nuclear. Let's see how the evidence looks among the Maya. And the reason I want to talk about the Maya is because for about 5 decades, almost 5 decades, Mormon scholars have been absolutely certain that Lehi's family, when they arrived, they marched inland. They established the city of Zarahemla. Well, no, the city of Nephi.
Nephi would be the first one, yeah, the land of Nephi.
John Sorensen used to believe that was the same location as Guatemala City, a place called Caminalhuyu. Oh, it's hard to pronounce. Caminalhuyu, which is a Native American city that is on the outskirts of Guatemala City, on the bottom, pretty much the bottom, one of those bottom dots. I think I can't see it, this resolution, but
I can try to make it a little bigger
Yeah,
here.
so the Mormon scholars have believed for 40 years that the Mayan civilization was really where the Book of Mormon people flourished, and they were critical for kicking it off, which is obviously complete garbage. It's racist claptrap. The Mayans kicked off their own civilizations. Thank you very much.
Yep.
They didn't require any input from Middle Eastern populations, Jewish populations, Hebrews, and we know that now clearly from the DNA. This illustrates the power of DNA. You can for 40 years, they could get away with their Mayan apologetics, their limited geography apologetics in Mesoamerica, based on faulty interpretations of the archaeological evidence and the anthropological evidence. And the reason for that is that archaeological evidence and anthropological evidence and data and the interpretation of that data is very subjective, meaning that it's much more susceptible to the personal opinions of the scientist that's interpreting the data. And so if you have a very fixed view that Hebrews came to America and you're looking to prove that and find evidence to back that up, then you're much more likely to see evidence of Hebrews in the archaeological record. But DNA is not subjective. DNA is objective. And that's probably why I'm speaking fairly firmly. We know for a fact Mayans do not have Hebrew ancestry at all. That's a fact. It's not an opinion. I can't. If a scientist wanted to challenge that, meaning that, if my interpretation is wrong, then they can do that. But the scientific community is convinced that they don't have Israelite ancestry. The evidence shows very clearly that they're related to all other Native Americans and have an Asian origin for their ancestry. So the Mayan populations have been extensively studied because they're just a fascinating population. They were the first New World population to develop writing. They had a calendar. They were very sophisticated populations. And so, that's why Mormon scholars were attracted to them, because they were the most advanced population in the New World with a written language. They had large populations, they had cities, so they seemed like they were similar to the Book of Mormon people that Joseph Smith was describing in the Book of Mormon, and that's possibly because Joseph Smith was basing his ideas on what he was learning about Native American populations. But so 30 populations have been tested, the mitochondrial DNA is tested, and again, it's the same story. It's all Asian in origin, and the Asian and the ancient samples are also clearly of Asian origin. So it's very clear from the mitochondrial DNA, which is far less powerful than the nuclear DNA, but it's still a powerful technology. It's very clear that Native Americans don't carry any Middle Eastern DNA, that their ancestry is all derived from Asia. But if we flick on to the next slides, let's start talking about nuclear DNA, because this DNA is far more information rich. So this slide just sort of illustrates, it's just a crude illustration of the human chromosomes with just thousands and thousands of points of difference. And the different colors can be thought to represent markers that are distinct, that are linked to a particular population. For example, a Hebrew population versus a Native American population. So, for example, the yellow markers could be distinctly Hebrew markers, whereas the red markers could be distinctly Native American markers. But it's a huge resource of information that scientists have been able to use. And the reason that it came along later on is that we didn't even have the full human genome sequence until the year 2000. Okay, and so once that came along, scientists then sequenced another genome and then another genome, and then they started to compare them. And it took probably the best part of a decade for them to accumulate a lot of information and start to learn about the variation in the human genome. Back in the 90s, the genome we just sort of imagined as this huge, complicated black box that we're never going to be able to get to the bottom of. But now it's, as I mentioned earlier, scientists can routinely sequence the entire genome. And it's very easy for a skilled scientist, a human geneticist, to distinguish Middle Eastern DNA, Semitic DNA, Hebrew DNA from Native American DNA, because there are just millions of differences in that DNA. So the next slide talks about one of these sort of studies where they've looked at the nuclear DNA. So this was a study on Latin Americans, 6,500 Latin Americans. So these are people from Central and South America who know that they have European ancestry, okay? So there's a bias in the study. They're focusing in on people who have mixed European and Native American ancestry. Part of the reason was because they wanted to know where that European ancestry came from. And that's very easy to do with nuclear DNA. So if you look in the box in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see a little map of Europe. And you can see the blue circles there are Northern Europe, like places like Germany and France and England. And if you look down on the Iberian Peninsula, you can see the pink circles, which are Portugal. Then you've got the orange and red and purple there that are Spain and Spanish populations. Green over there is, I think, Italy and Greece. No, Italy. Now, when you look, on the map, on the broader map of South America and Central America, each one of the dots that you can see is an individual. It's a little pie. We can't see really the full breakup, but you get the general idea. Each dot is an individual, and their genome has been represented by a little tiny pie chart. And that pie chart is illustrating where their European ancestry came from. Now, we all know that Brazil has a very high proportion of people that came from Portugal. And that's why a lot of the dots in Brazil are pink. And you can see that the DNA is backing up what we know from the historical record. And it's the same on the west coast of Mexico and running from Colombia down to Chile. A lot of orange and red in the individuals there. And that lines up nicely with what we know, these Spanish, heavily influenced by the Spanish in Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. And you can also see quite a bit of an Italian influence. I think that might be Uruguay. Is that roughly where Uruguay is?
Yeah, I think so. And that's near Argentina too, right? I don't think they're quite into Argentina. Yeah.
So each one of those this is an enormous study. Each one, that's 6,500 dots for Latin Americans. And each one of those dots, the scientists have examined, each one of those people, the scientists have examined their genome at 700,000 places to tell them about their ancestry. So it's an extraordinary amount of information. But there was a very interesting discovery that I haven't heard any Mormon scientists get excited about yet, but they have found Semitic DNA. So keep in mind that these 6,500 Latin Americans are biased towards people who have European ancestry, okay? So there's a bias towards, and that's because they want to find out where this European ancestry came from. And it's not surprising that there was a tiny proportion of Middle Eastern people that came in. And the people that did come in were mostly conversos. These are Hebrews that had migrated out of the Middle East into the Iberian Peninsula, into Spain and into Portugal. They were called conversos. They would migrate into these areas, and in order to prevent persecution, to avoid persecution, which often was being killed, they falsely converted to the predominant religion. So at the time it was possibly Catholicism. Lots of conversos obviously hopped on the ships and sailed to the Americas. So that's why the scientists are detecting this Semitic DNA. But the really neat thing is the scientists can tell you when this Semitic DNA arrived in the Americas. Okay, so we don't have to assume that it came in on Spanish ships. The scientists can estimate when it came. So we flick to the next slide. There's a very powerful dating method that scientists use with nuclear DNA. Because our nuclear DNA is arranged in chromosomes, there's a unique feature of chromosomal inheritance which results in the chromosomes being chopped up every generation. So if you look at it, say, for example, back in 1580, the Spanish male married a Native American female. When they pass on their DNA to their children, each of their children will carry a pure Spanish and a pure Native American matching chromosome. So for all of the chromosomes, there's a matching Native American and a matching Spanish chromosome. But when they pass on their DNA to their offspring, and in most cases they would have been intermarrying other Native Americans, what you can see is that the chromosomes start to get broken up in. So the chromosomes, there's a process called recombination that happens. So the Spanish and Native American chromosomes in their children, when they pass on their sex chromosome, a process called recombination occurs so that each chromosome, say chromosome 1, that they pass on is actually part Spanish. A huge chunk of it will be Spanish and a large chunk will be Native American. And you can see it in the grandchildren. But with each generation, there's a recombination event. So each generation you get chopping and chopping and chopping. And so the chunks of Spanish and DNA get smaller and smaller and smaller due to this process of recombination in each generation. And so the length of the the length of the Spanish chromosomes, or the foreign chromosomes that came in, gets shorter and shorter, and the length is related to how long ago that DNA first arrived in the Americas. Okay, and scientists have looked at the length of those Spanish chromosomal chunks in all of those Native American populations in that study, and compared it to the Semitic DNA that came in, and it's the same length. Okay, it's been through the same amount, the same number of recombinations that have chopped up the chunks of chromosome, and so they've got smaller and smaller, and it's identical. So the time that Semitic DNA, the converso DNA from Jews in Spain and Portugal, is entirely consistent with them traveling on Spanish galleons to get to the Americas.
It's amazing.
Okay, so
it's amazing that you can pinpoint it like that. What about somebody that would say, an apologist that would say, yeah, but if they if they came, 6,000 years ago or whatever, that it would just be gone because it's chopped up, no trace left at all.
Well, that's the funny thing about nuclear DNA, because nuclear DNA is not far less prone to going extinct
It never
than
goes away.
mitochondrial DNA. Because let's just say, for argument's sake, that the vanishing, well, that Lehi and his family came across, and there's only 20, and they just mixed with the Native American populations and somehow took control of them and then led them for 1,000 years. As they've intermarried with Native American populations, their DNA will move into the Native American populations. So the Native American populations will be preserving their DNA, not making it go extinct. And if it was present in Native American populations, it would be easily distinguishable. Scientists they've got millions of markers that are available for detecting Semitic populations, and I can absolutely guarantee you that these scientists are not going out of their way to avoid discovering something like a Semitic group moving into the Americas, because if they discovered that, they'd be rushing to publish, because it would be the most important discovery in the last 50 years in New World science.
And the same thing if they found Egyptian DNA, if they found African DNA, if they found European DNA from way back, because it would completely rewrite history. So any of those show up, the scientists would be excited about it, but none of that's showing up. I know when I went on my mission, we used to show, pictures of the Mayan
calendar,
the pyramid-like things, and you say, look, they built pyramids. That's because they learned from the Egyptians and brought it over. But the DNA is clear. There were no Egyptians. There were no Hebrews. That this is just a similar idea that which shows you that two cultures completely separated can come up with similar ideas and do similar things.
Yeah, it's a fairly obvious thing if you start building anything. If you want to go high, it's got to be four-sided.
Yeah.
Three-sided is very, very difficult. Four-sided's very simple.
Yeah.
If you want to build upwards, a huge structure,
you got to narrow it in.
Pyramids are very stable. That's why they've survived so long. There would have been plenty of buildings, I'm sure, in Central America that were, regular houses with vertical walls and roofs, but a lot of those just collapsed. But the pyramids survived that long. But there is I'll give a really clear example of how maybe we'll skip to that slide now. A clear example of how nuclear DNA, if you go ahead, we'll come back to this slide. We'll talk about this in a moment.
Landon.
I want to just tell you about what they've discovered in Polynesian populations, and this was research only published a couple of years ago. It's been well known in the scientific community that Polynesia was colonized from the West. Their ancestors, and there's a bunch of reasons for this, it's primarily based on physical appearance, language, archaeology, for example, lapita pottery, all these sorts of things, and the types of settlements they've seen throughout the South Pacific. The Polynesians descend from people that migrated out of Taiwan and the northern Philippines about 3,000 years ago. And they skipped along the coast of Papua New Guinea. They didn't stay there very long. And they landed in Tonga and Samoa about 3,000 years ago. So it only took them maybe a century or less to get out into the Pacific. So they got into Tonga and Samoa. And then in about AD 830, they colonized eastern Polynesia in the Marquesas Islands, which are in French Polynesia. And by the time they got out into the Marquesas Islands, the Polynesians had honed their navigational skills to perfection. They knew exactly how to get around. They rushed up and they colonized Hawaii. Look at the distances. That's probably 7,000 or 8,000. I could be wrong, but it's probably at least 5,000 kilometers to Hawaii. About 8,000 kilometers back to New Zealand. They colonized New Zealand. And they didn't just go there in one journey. They went there in multiple journeys. Can you imagine that? People from the Marquesas Islands sailing, and they had these huge outrigger canoes, so they took their whole families, whole tribes, piles of food, pigs, animals, you name it. They colonized New Zealand. They came back, told everyone, and then they went back again to the same place. Okay. They're navigating by the stars. They knew exactly where they were. Very stable craft that they were sailing. And I was just reading today about the Marquesas Islands. One of the reasons why they wanted to migrate elsewhere was because the Marquesas are very dry islands. They're not ideal for human colonization, quite low rainfall. And so their populations really struggled over the time. There were periods when it was very, very dry. The Humboldt Current goes across, and it's a very dry airstream. So they were pretty keen to get away from there. So they also colonized Rapa Nui down there. That's Easter Island, another name for Easter Island. But what scientists discovered a couple of years ago is that about 800 years ago, DNA from the Xenu tribe in Colombia made its way over to the Marquesas Islands. They've also found DNA from tribes in Chile that is found on Rapa Nui, but that DNA arrived after Columbus. So this was after Chile had sort of taken ownership and colonized Easter Island.
So this would have been when there was large sailing ships available that they could have gone. But that 1231 is quite interesting because that would have been.
This is before Columbus.
Yeah, long before those ships.
Yeah. So at the time this was published, I was quite amused really because it was published in a very prestigious journal, but the authors were sort of intimating that, this could have been Native Americans voyaging out into the Pacific. I think that's hogwash. I think there's absolutely no chance that Native Americans all of a sudden, let's sail 8,000 kilometers into the Pacific, when the Polynesians were routinely sailing these huge distances in all these directions. So the sailing technology was remarkable with Polynesia. They could sail upwind, tacking. Their crafts were very, very these navigation skills were amazing. Stars, clouds, everything. They were just absorbed every bit of information from their environment. So they were, so if anybody had the skill to get from the Marquesas Islands into South America and back, it was the Polynesians. So, but what's really interesting is that scientists now know it's very easy for them to determine how much Xenu DNA is present in a bunch of populations in French Polynesia. So if we go to the next slide, back, you've gone 15 slides ahead. There we go. So if we look at this slide, you can see the Marquesas Islands, people there have about 4% Xenu DNA. And progressively, as you move further and further away, quite a few of these islands are thousands of kilometers from the Marquesas Islands. Some of these islands have tiny, tiny traces, even down to 0.01% of Xenu DNA. That's sort of 1 in 10,000 ancestors. Okay, it's a tiny fraction. Does this look like DNA going to extinct? This is DNA preservation. Okay, so the DNA of the original, I think it's unlikely. I think the most likely thing is that a big family group arrived in the Americas. They picked up a few things. They decided, this place is looking fairly populated. They might have picked up sweet potatoes because sweet potatoes found their way all across the Pacific. Although I'm not sure that's the case. I think the sweet potato in the Pacific floated there. That's right. There is evidence that the sweet potato in the Pacific floated into the Pacific and was there thousands of years before humans arrived. But that was a common apologist argument for a connection between the two. But so this is a clear example of the preservation of DNA in surrounding populations in the Pacific, and you would expect the same. As I was saying, with this group that went to the Americas, they came back. Oh, it's possible that it was a family group, and they brought one or several people back with them into the Pacific. They may have lived there for a little while and intermarried with the local population. But at this stage, there's no evidence I've heard of Polynesian DNA in the American Indian populations. But I'm pretty certain there'll be scientists who'll be thinking very hard about testing more closely in Colombian populations, particularly in the Xenu populations, to see if they can pick up any sign of Polynesian DNA that's arrived there. But we would expect the same thing. If Lehi arrived in the Americas and Lehi and his group mixed with the populations, and they would have to have been a very, very tiny little group who didn't mix with the surrounding population very much, and they were so insignificant that they made no contribution to the gene pool, and then they disappeared.
Not what we're told. We're told they pretty much took over everything, right? And had millions of
descendants. Was to convert the Lamanites.
Yep.
It's much simpler to accept the truth, and the truth is Native Americans don't have Hebrew ancestry, and as many of the apologists know and have acknowledged, the Book of Mormon has lots of similarities to the ideas that were floating around in Joseph Smith's community, that he picked up all of those ideas and he put them into the Book of Mormon, and it's not real history.
This even contradicts the Book of Mormon, because the Book of Mormon says Haygoth, sailed off from the Americas and colonized all of the Polynesian islands, and this is showing that it's the opposite. The Polynesian islands came to the Americas, not the other way around.
Yeah, look, there's no definitive evidence, hard evidence to prove that it was the Polynesian that went there and they came back. But it makes there's absolutely no reason to believe Native Americans made that journey. Because you think about it, they didn't have a history of sailing long distances. Polynesians did. Polynesians could travel in both directions very easily. You can see that with New Zealand. The New Zealand journey was a similar distance.
Yeah, but of course, since the percent of DNA is higher the further out you get, that's an indication that they were going left to right rather than right to left, because the further out you get, the less and less that population becomes.
Well, the Marquesas Islands are to the north. Most of those other islands, they're either part of the Marquesas Island group, and they're sort of towards the south.
Okay, so this is the same group of islands.
It's the same group of islands, but it's a huge area.
Okay,
it's a massive area. Like Rapa Nui is about 5,000 kilometers from the Marquesas Islands, and Morkie is, I don't know how to pronounce that name, but Mork down the bottom there is, I think, about 2,000 kilometers from the Marquesas Islands. So it just makes perfect sense that they came back to the Marquesas Islands, the Native American individuals, and they just merged into that population. So that population carries will carry the highest proportion of their DNA, but there have been movements from that group into the surrounding population. All of these islands, because they've maintained their sailing skill, though it would have been sailing backwards and forwards between all of these islands, and so during those migrations, people have met new partners, and there've been marriages, and there's been just a gradual spread of genes. But yeah, the more isolated populations have very, very tiny proportions, but it'll be a chance thing. It'll, one island might have more because just by chance they had more people arrived that had Native American ancestry.
And again, no chance that these were Nephites, because again, there may be DNA from the South American tribes but no Semitic DNA in any of these, because 100% of the DNA prior to the Spanish was Asian, so none of this would have been Semitic DNA.
Yeah, so this is Xenu DNA. So they would have, the scientists would have identified in their analysis, because when they compared the DNA of all of these island populations to the Americas, they didn't just compare it to the Xenu. They compared it to other populations all the way down the west coast of the Americas. And it was the Xenu that had the closest, their DNA was more closely related. And that would be because there would be thousands and thousands of markers in the genomics, in the nuclear DNA that they were studying, that were very specific to the Xenu population. And yeah. And, when we're talking about the chromosomal breakage analysis, the chunk analysis that told them how long ago the Spanish DNA arrived in the Americas, well, they did the same thing. That's how they worked out that the Xenu DNA arrived in the Pacific in AD 1230, because they looked at the length of the chunks of the Xenu DNA. In one of my other presentations, I've got a slide of one of the Easter Island individual that shows you the lengths of their the DNA that came from Chile and the DNA that came from Colombia, because tiny fractions of the Xenu DNA actually reached Rapa Nui, 5,000 kilometers away, which is really remarkable. But I wanted to go back to that slide we passed over, which is one of my favorites of the whole lot, because this brings it home. This brings the message home. This is basically a chromosomal map of a man named Ammon Bodie. Now, he's the adopted son of a very good friend of mine, Jean Bodie, in Canada, that we've been corresponding for yonks, probably 20 years, I can't remember, long time. And she's a wonderful ex-Mormon pioneer, and we've been good friends for a long time. So she adopted Ammon. His indigenous name is Thunderstealer, a beautiful name. And his ancestry, and this is just information derived from Family Tree DNA, one of the family DNA companies doing the rounds, and they would have genotyped or tested his nuclear DNA, which is all in all the chromosomes there, and they're able to say what each chunk of, they can identify all the chunks of his chromosomes and the origins of those chunks. So he's predominantly American Indian in the Siksika tribe, which is among the Blackfoot, which is in the Blackfoot, I think it's called a confederation, is that correct?
Yeah.
Not sure. So in the Blackfoot tribe, a larger tribal group. So the pink regions are American Indian, and scientists can easily distinguish many American Indian tribes from each other. So we can safely assume that's largely Blackfoot. But then you've got about 19% of his genome. You can see these chunks is blue from the United Kingdom, 3% from Finland. and then he's got chunks there that are either Slavic but also Asian. So chunks that sort of more closely line up with Siberian populations. So, this is a man that's been told his whole life in the church that he's a Lamanite, he's descended from Jews, but now he has, and he always struggled with it. He never really identified with this. Thankfully, Ammon's story really has a happy ending. He's got a really clear sense of who his ancestors are, and he's very prominent in the Blackfoot community, in the Indigenous American community, because he now knows his true ancestry. There is no Hebrew ancestry there. And this is the same sort of data, it's just illustrated in a different way, that scientists are using to interrogate the genomes of hundreds, thousands of Indigenous Americans.
It was amazing to me when we read a book in our book club on DNA, and then a lot of us took the test just to kind of see, and it was amazing. It told you, it could show you exactly where your relatives, when they came out of Africa, where they went up into the Middle East, then how they went up into Europe, about what years or how long ago they came, when they came across the to the Americas. I mean, I could trace it. It was literally my whole history, clear back to the beginning almost of the human race. It was that accurate. How much, like you said, how much Neanderthal you had. It was really quite fascinating.
Yeah, the reason we can't lose our Neanderthal DNA is that because it was so long ago, it's been broken up. Every year, every generation, there's that recombination is occurring, and it gets chopped up and chopped up and chopped up. So it's now tiny chunks, tiny chunks. So it might only be a few million base pairs long, or a few 100,000 or a few thousand base pairs long, these chunks of Neanderthal DNA. So they're all along our chromosomes. And so when there's a crossing over that occurs, it's just crossing over of chromosomes. Both of the chromosomes have thousands of chunks of Neanderthal DNA. So there's no opportunity for it to go extinct. It just won't go extinct. And it's the same with Native American DNA. If there was Lehigh DNA, coming in the 600 BC and 300 BC, it would have gone into the surrounding populations. It would have been chopped up into smaller and smaller chunks, been spread out all across the chromosomes, and it would just be there forever. Mm-hmm. It won't ever go extinct unless God chooses to remove it from Native American populations.
And that's one of the arguments, right? Same as archaeological evidence, right? God has taken it. But I love it when we were texting before and you said that. You said, look, there's Neanderthal DNA, that exists from so far back. Lehite DNA is relatively recent. You can't eradicate it. If it's there, it's not there when it comes to Lehite DNA.
Yeah. But the nuclear, it would never go away. It would be preserved in the nuclear.
Yeah, if Lehigh and his population and his descendants were 1%, 0.5%, 0.1% of the population they're in, you just can't. It just doesn't work this way in human populations, where a tiny little group of people come in and they make no genetic contribution to the population, but they rule it for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Exactly. Just does not happen. Mm-hmm. So,
and they have millions of populations of hundreds of thousands to millions, and leave no genetic markers. That's not possible.
They've tested 500 populations of Native Americans. Now you would think that let's say Nephi was one person, a tiny little group of 20, and they merged with a little village where there were only couple of hundred other people, and they ruled that village for 1,000 years and invented all these other stories, and ignore those other stories for the moment. You would still expect the nuclear DNA to move into the surrounding villages, because these people move around, just like the people in the Pacific move thousands of kilometers. They move from village to village, trade, wars, migration,
missionary work,
famine, missionary work, you name it, all that sort of stuff. Their DNA gets passed on. Surely by now, we've been doing this, we're playing this game for 40 years. Where is this population? And the more isolated they become, the more ridiculous it gets. So it's just
Exactly.
yeah, they couldn't have contributed anything if they were that small.
But one of the arguments that I always hear is, well, they were all killed off. But as you say, even if they were killed off, they would have had an impact. They, like you said, they would have traded. They would have probably had children with other, all around. It's not just that group that was in the battle that ends all DNA. Yeah. That doesn't happen.
But if the Book of Mormon was written to the Lamanites.
Yeah.
It was written to the Lamanites to convince them, to convert them to Jesus Christ. So it's very, very. It's the stick of Joseph. Yeah.
So there's got to be some Lamanites.
What's this nonsense about them just going extinct? If your argument is they've gone extinct, then you're arguing that the Book of Mormon is false.
Useless.
Yeah.
There is a limit to how much you can twist the scriptures to the point where your interpretation is just complete garbage. Yeah. So.
Yeah, it's insurmountable.
But yeah, now that we're talking crazy town.
Yeah, no, it's insurmountable.
Let's really go to crazy town.
It's absolutely ridiculous, but yep. Kennewick man.
Yeah, so there's as I mentioned earlier, for 50 years the church has defended a Mesoamerican limited geography theory. But when DNA came along and created all the problems that it created, it has spawned the emergence of really what is essentially a creationist response to the science. Okay, so there are a lot of Mormons, just like me, who are totally convinced that all Native Americans were descended from the Book of Mormon people, and they just refused. This group of apologists, the Heartland apologists, just couldn't accept the limited geography theories. And there's been a lot of animosity between these two parties over the last 20 years. But in terms of who's winning the battle, I'd have to say that the Heartland apologists are streets ahead of the limited geography folk. So those connected to BYU are sort of quietly persisting with their Mayan belief, their Mesoamerican theories, but the science is just exposing that more and more. But there's the group that's now responding and had these beefs with the Mesoamerican apologists, the Heartland group, are now twisting the science to defend the Book of Mormon. And I just want to focus on one particular piece of science that's particularly relevant to the Heartland theory, because it was it's the discovery of Kennewick Man in 1996 that really has, and the extensive amount of research that's been done on this skeleton has created enormous challenges for the Heartland theory apologetics. So to quickly summarize what the Heartland is, Rodney Meldrum was the apologist who became quite upset with the church's response via its BYU apologists to the DNA. And he then launched into a study of the DNA research, even though he has no scientific training or no scientific qualifications and no training at all. And he has completely convinced himself that the X lineage, which was rare in Native Americans, is derived from Israel. And he has resisted all criticism from both BYU apologists and myself over the years, and refuses to concede that the X lineage is derived from Asia. And his main argument is that it doesn't appear in Asia. And that's because it's just a rare lineage that is either extinct in Asia or hasn't been detected yet because they haven't studied many populations there. So the X lineage has been extensively studied and it's not derived from Asia. But so the Heartland apologists were going along quite happily, and then Kennewick Man arrived, and this is where things got problematic for them, because the bones of Kennewick Man clearly predate the Book of Mormon by about 5,000 years. The skeleton is about 9,000 years old. So I'll tell you a little bit about the background of that. So the reason Kennewick Man sort of created a little bit of controversy is when he was first recovered, the bones were washed out of the banks of the Columbia River in the town of Kennewick in eastern Washington state.
That's where I grew up.
In Kennewick?
In Richland, right next to Kennewick. So yeah,
cool.
Right there. That's why I follow it so closely.
It never rains there, doesn't it?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, nuclear rain, perhaps. Yes. And it was a nuclear town area, but yeah, no, it's pretty dry.
Really? It's really, really dry compared to
very dry.
Western Washington.
Yep. Yeah, it's not like Seattle area that's gorgeous and green and rainy. No, this is the eastern, Yep.
Yeah. But you have an awful lot of water flowing through.
Yep, we got the Columbia River.
From the upper reaches, which I'd love to get there one day because it's fascinating geology. But it's got a history of very, very catastrophic floods that have gone through there, particularly at the end of the Ice Age. There was a massive, massive flood, went through and just flattened the whole area. It was pretty remarkable geology. But so Kennewick Man created controversy for a number of reasons. The main one was that the shape of the skull looked more similar to Europeans than it did to Native American populations. And unfortunately, there are quite a lot of racists in America, and they took that and used that evidence to support the idea that Native Americans had come in and wiped out a European population that was there before them. Something that fits very nicely with the Book of Mormon story, and so the skeleton got locked up. There were a lot of very sad disputes and very unfortunate legal battles between Indigenous tribes and scientists and the broader community, and it became very, very difficult. It was very problematic. But there was a little window there where scientists studied the skeleton. They had access to and they got the DNA from Kennewick Man. About 30 very eminent scientists studied the skeleton, and so there was a very, very detailed study that took place. But the skeleton has now been repatriated. It's gone back to the Indigenous tribe, and I think it's the last I've heard. It's been buried in an undisclosed location. So, which is unfortunate for the scientists who wanted to study him a bit more. But they learnt an awful lot about Kennewick Man. And none of it's good for the Book of Mormon story. So one of the first things they did is they radiocarbon dated the skeleton. So it was buried on the banks of the Columbia River, and it was buried around about 1.2 meters. Found that the skeleton was mostly washed out of the banks of the river, so they didn't have any bones that were stuck in the bank of the river to tell them exactly where the skeleton was from. But the scientists were able to look at the soil that was attached to the skeleton and match it up with the soil in the profile to tell them how deep the skeleton was buried. And it was about 1.2 meters. So there's a lot of other research. There's a 300-page book on this research, and we're only going to scratch the surface. But in order to carbon date the age of the skeleton, the scientists isolated collagen from the bones. Kennewick man's bones were remarkably well preserved. Most bones are very degraded, but they were able to isolate collagen, which is a protein in the bones. And if you can isolate protein from the bones, then you have bones. You have carbon that is unambiguously from those bones. It can't come from anywhere else because it's carbon in collagen, because collagen contains carbon. It's a carbon-containing molecule. So that's why it's the gold standard in scientific research. If you want to date the age of a skeleton, is to first get collagen. If you can't get collagen, that indicates the bones are broken down, and you have to then, in desperation, use other parts of the bone, which has much more calcium. And then it's more difficult to date. And one of the reasons is that as the skeleton lies buried in the soil, deep down in the soil, carbon actually new carbon infiltrates the soil because rainwater carries dissolved carbon dioxide. Okay, whenever you go into a limestone cave underground, what you're seeing is calcium carbonate, which is dissolved carbon dioxide that is percolated down through the soil, gone into a cave, and then it's dripped down. You form these stalactites and stalagmites. But that carbon came from the air. So Kennewick man had a whole pile of carbonates that were attached to the bone. So you can imagine the water percolating down through the soil, and eventually evaporation at the surface, and there's lots of evaporation happening in Kennewick because it's a very dry location. But you can imagine a big rainfall event, lots of fresh carbon coming down through the soil. Well, a lot of the calcium carbonate that had formed on the bones of Kennewick man, quite a bit of that was carbon dated as well, because the scientists were just curious. They wanted to know when the calcium carbonate formed. And lo and behold, the calcium carbonate dates, the carbon dating of the calcium carbonate is just in the Book of Mormon period, just when you'd want Kennewick man to have lived. And the little face you can see there is actually stolen from the scientific research face. That's a book by David Reed, and he's a Heartland apologist, and he's not only borrowed the Smithsonian Institute created that face, and they were not able to prevent him from using it on his apologetic book because they have to produce publicly accessible science. So they can't prevent it. I've actually communicated with those scientists, and they were deeply hurt that their science is going to be used to back up the lies and the pseudoscience of the Heartland community. But David Reed was pretty much the one who's decided, okay, well, I'm going to defend the Book of Mormon in the face of Kennewick man. And so he has focused all of his attention on the carbonates and claims that this is evidence that Kennewick man is 2,500 to 2,500 years old, and that he could very well be a descendant of Nephi. But this is completely false. Kennewick man, we know, because as I've explained, protein, if you get protein, it's got to come from Kennewick man himself. It can't come from anywhere else because they do chemical tests and they can tell that it's protein. It's got all of the chemical molecules in it that are found in protein. So we know that those dates are reliable, and the carbonate dates
So
are unreliable.
that's the same argument they're using with that horse bone they found, correct?
Yep.
They're dating the carbonates and not the bone itself.
Yep. I responded to that horse study in Mexico. It was exactly the same problem. In fact, in the paper that was published, the paper was authored by, the lead author was a Mormon apologist.
Mm-hmm.
His name escapes me at the moment. It'll probably come to me. But the paper actually acknowledges that the soil was filled with carbonates all the way through the soil. They could have done. There are now other more sophisticated dating techniques where you don't have to rely on the you don't run into this problem with the carbonates, but they hadn't used those, so they got fooled by rainwater.
Yeah.
So the rainwater just comes down and over. For the first, you can imagine that for the first 4,000 or 5,000 years, the rain, because the bones are closer to the surface, the rainwater is just passing the bones, and it's forming a calcium carbonate layer probably around about a meter down below the bones. But as the soil layers build up, and in Kennewick they build up by dust storms generally and big floods, the bones get deeper and deeper. Then as the rain's percolating down, as the bones get deeper and deeper, and the evaporation, it drives the precipitation of the calcium carbonate closer and closer and closer to the bones. And about 2,500 years ago, that's when the calcium carbonates were forming at the depth the bones were at by that time, which was about 1.2 meters. So, look, not content to misinterpret the carbon dating, which has been done by professional scientists, and thousands of PhDs have reviewed this science and seen it published and have not criticized it because it's so well done. David Reed, an attorney, has decided that he's right, and he's focusing all of his attention on the carbonates, and he's completely wrong. In fact, at this point, we can hop to the next slide, and I'll show you just how sad this whole thing is, because I've communicated with the scientist that picked up the bones and was closely involved in the carbon dating. So he knows exactly what went on. And David Reed, in his naivety, wrote to this scientist, Jim Chatters, and sent him a copy of his interpretation of David Reed's research. And I'll read it out. So the approximately 2,000-year dates you cling to are actually dates on soil carbonate, which deposits continuously from water percolating down from the surface. They are not dates on the skeleton at all.
And so this is
a little while later,
Jim
2 days
answering the apologist, the Mormon apologist, and saying, no, let me help you understand.
And the apologist has gone back, tried to defend himself, and Jim has come back and said, bottom line, the carbonate dates from Cayman's bones are not reliable. There was really no research reason to do them. It was just a curiosity. They just wanted to know when they formed. Okay, the reliable carbon date age of Cayman, that's his abbreviation for Kennewick Man, based on both the projectile point in the pelvis, and we'll get onto that, and the protein in his bones is around 8,400 BP, which is before present. So there you have, I mean, I feel for these guys because I get angry.
Yeah.
I mean, he's been told that he's wrong by the scientists who did the research. These are PhD qualified scientists who spent decades working in this field. And it's just the most naive and dumb mistake to make. And it's been pointed out. And in my view, that's just intellectual dishonesty. He's being dishonest. He's lying to everyone. He's been told that and it's just so, it's so annoying. And the other thing I noticed in my correspondence with the scientists is just how reluctant they were to get drawn into this.
Exactly. We find that all the time. We ask different scientists to come on to talk about things. And if it has anything to do with the religious aspect of somebody trying to cling to something, they don't even really want to counter it. They just want to distance themselves, because you can't tell someone Santa Claus doesn't exist if they have to have Santa Claus exist. So
I corresponded with the lead author of this. I won't say his name just so he doesn't get exposed. But, he works at the Smithsonian Institute.
Yeah.
And I can assure you, well, the Smithsonian knows who butters their bread. They know who pays their salaries.
Yeah.
It's the United States government. And I'll tell you another little factoid that's quite interesting is that you might remember that many years ago, the Smithsonian used to publish a standard letter that they would send out to naive Mormons that would write to them and ask them, hey, how's the Book of Mormon helping you with your research? And so they would write back and give a fairly detailed explanation of how the Book of Mormon has no relationship to the research that they're doing. And it gave fairly interesting details there. Well,
we bring that up quite often.
Mormon senators paid the Smithsonian a visit.
Yep.
And they reminded them that the Book of Mormon is a very sacred spiritual book. It's very important to lots of Mormons. So what are you doing sending this letter out and criticizing the Book of Mormon? And so they promptly edited the letter so that it just said, now I think it just says the Book of Mormon is not used in their research.
Yeah. No, I think we've shown on different podcasts the two versions of it. And you're right. They just can't, they will not weigh in. They're just, not going to do it.
It was Mormon senators.
Yep.
I don't know that they would have said, listen, you guys, this will impact your funding, but why would you take Mormon senators along?
Yeah, no, it's kind of implied, isn't it? Yeah, you can't rock that boat. Yeah, no, we've been surprised. We've been shocked at scientists, not connected at all to the Mormon community, but they definitely have research that's, relevant. And when we ask them to just talk about that, not even anything to do with Mormonism, but of course, it pretty much proves what Mormonism is trying to say isn't accurate. Yeah. They just won't do it. They go, I have Mormon friends and family. I don't want to weigh in, or I just don't want to hurt anybody, or I don't want to be seen as a religious bigot. They just will not touch it. So let everybody in that silo just continue in that fantasy. I mean, there's no way to break those walls.
Fortunately, there are scientists who have been prepared to weigh in and make fairly clear declarations of what the science is showing.
Yeah, like you.
And they have appeared on the odd podcast here and there. So I really take my hat off to those folks. Generally, they're people who are so senior that it's not going to impact their funding.
Right.
They're at universities where they're well and truly are not going to be impacted. So they're usually fairly safe. But let's go back to the Heartland slide, because I want to run through quickly all of the other evidence. I mean, the carbon dating is enough to sink the Heartlanders, partly because it's age, but also it, unfortunately for the Heartlanders, he carries the X lineage. That's the main problem with Kennewick Man. They had to address the fact that he carried the X lineage. But not only that, the X lineage that Kennewick Man carries is ancestral to all of the other ones. Okay, so if you imagine a family tree, you've got it at the trunk, you've got the Kennewick Man, there's this branch, and there's other branches and other branches. Well, all of the X lineages, X2A lineages that Native Americans carry, modern day ones, are up there in the small branches, right? They've got quite a few mutations have occurred in them that are not seen in the Kennewick Man X2 lineage. Now, David Reed has gone in and he's dug out Middle Eastern X lineages, and he's claiming that they're closely related to Native Americans, but they're not. If you picture that tree again, that trunk where the Kennewick Man is, and just lift that trunk further up, and you assume that there's more branches going further down, the Middle Eastern lineages are on a deeper branch, that comes in and joins up probably 10,000 years before Kennewick Man, 5 or 10,000 years before. Okay, so
the Semitic DNA is 19,000 years old. That falls in there is what you're saying, basically.
The Semitic, the link back to the ancestral Semitic DNA or Middle Eastern DNA is probably 19. It's hard to know at that stage because one or two mutations will make a massive difference, and so it's either 5,000 years before Kennewick Man, which is 14,000 years ago, or it's 10 to 15,000 years before Kennewick Man. So it's in the sort of 15,000 to 25,000 years ago that there's a common ancestor. More likely 30,000 years ago. That's roughly when they think Native Americans shared a common ancestor with Middle Eastern populations. But the other evidence that's really relevant, fascinatingly, Kennewick Man's skeleton carried a spear point head in his pelvis. Okay, so he'd been speared when he was alive. He'd broken off the shaft of the spear, but the stone spear point was lodged in his pelvis. It healed up, the bone healed around the stone, and he lived for a few years after it might have been an accidental spearing. That's what they suspect, I think.
Like he speared himself? Oh, no.
No, not, well, probably from somebody he was hunting with, I suspect. Maybe they were just sort of, turning around and bang.
Right. Oh, whoops. I'm so sorry, Kennewick Man. Pardon me.
I don't know how they would. That's possibly the way that, like, if you were throwing it at aggressively at someone, you'd hit him in the front, but it might have been that it speared from the back or something. I don't know.
I bet it was his wife. That's my guess.
Yeah. It's always,
but there was evidence that he was buried.
That's right. That's right.
But anyway, he survived it. So, and that's possibly why they also think that it was an accidental thing. So people took care of him and whatever. But they have the X-ray of the spear point. They know the shape of it. Okay, so there's a lot of people who studied spear points in Native American populations, including all over that part of the Americas. So they know roughly, and the spear points change over time as the technology evolves. So the spear point will tell you lock that spear into a particular time period, and that's 7,000 to 9,000 years ago. Another reason to believe that Kennewick Man predates the Book of Mormon by a very, very long time. Kennewick Man's genome has been sequenced. We now know that nuclear DNA is very, very powerful and contains an awful lot of information. If he was carrying any Hebrew DNA, I can absolutely guarantee you it wouldn't be me telling you about it for the first time. You would have read about that in the headline of the New York Times, or in major news. But no, he clearly it did carry no Middle Eastern DNA in there at all, just related to Asian populations and other Native American populations. So it's been fascinating because they compare the genome and they're able to match him up with other populations in the Americas. So they know where his descendants or people related to him ended up. And I can't remember exactly, but I think the local populations were fairly closely related to him. So they've compared him to local Indigenous Americans in Washington. But the other thing they were able to do with the bones, which is really fascinating, is they can do isotope analysis of things like nitrogen and oxygen as opposed to carbon. And this is really fascinating stuff, which I don't really know a great deal about, but they can distinguish the sort of diet that people have. And if Native Americans didn't sort of become serious salmon farmers, because it became basically an industry by about 5,000 years ago. Prior to that, they were hunter-gatherers. They relied on lots of other food, but then their diet became almost exclusively the fish they could catch in the Columbia River. And so they became very, very skilled at catching fish and preserving it, drying it out, all that sort of stuff. That didn't take place until about 5,000 years ago. So the oxygen and nitrogen data, and that, because those isotopes will form part of proteins and the food that the Indigenous Americans are eating, the composition enabled them to determine that the Kennewick man was a hunter-gatherer. He was not eating. They hadn't really become, well, they weren't living in domesticated settlements with lots and lots of salmon and farming. There was no agriculture. It was hunter-gathering, because those isotopes reveal if people have gone through periods of hunger, really struggling, that starts to really appear in the isotopic records of those elements. And so they're able to determine from that he was a hunter-gatherer. Again, that's entirely consistent with his age, 9,000 years old. So if you ignore all of that science and you try to, and you focus, this is the problem when you have fixed views and you're only looking at the science for what you want the science to tell you, you end up perverting the whole piece of research. And I mean, that's the best word for what David Reed's done. It's just a perversion. He's perverted all of the research that these scientists have done in this book, because he knows in his own little brain that there was a global flood 4,500 years ago and that the Americas were populated 2,500 years ago. And that's it. So, yep. Kennewick man really is
science, to match that.
I don't remember the Nephites being hunter-gatherers or, they were farmers. I don't remember any stories of them, preserving salmon in the Book of Mormon. So even if you wanted to make the argument that Kennewick man lived 2,500 years ago in the Northwest, he would have been eating salmon and storing salmon, not farming barley and wheat and all the other things that they're farming in the Book of Mormon. Yeah.
Yeah. And he would have probably lived a much happier life with all the modern comforts that they had 5,000 years ago.
Yeah, apparently they did have modern comforts. Yeah. But it's the same thing when a new city is discovered, right? It just happened a couple of weeks ago in South America. And throw the dates out the window. Nobody cares. Look, it might be Zarahemla, right? I'm seeing that all over the place. It doesn't matter. Any simplistic exploration of these things that make it sort of fit or seem like it might be from Book of Mormon times, it gives you goosebumps. It's very exciting. Everybody talks about it.
Yeah, so I think I'm at the end.
Yep, I think so.
You're at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, look, there are two things going on in the Mormon apologetic community. And one of them is really, really twisting the words of Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon to salvage the wreck. They're trying to claim that they're hiding away somewhere. We just haven't found them. And this is the view that this book that's coming out shortly by Hugo Perego and I think it's John Butler from BYU. I suspect John Butler has been brought in to bolster the response to the nuclear DNA, although I haven't seen what they've written yet.
No, but I've seen you can pre-order it. It's about to come out. It's in that whole series. If you guys are all familiar with the Deseret book, it's called Let's Talk About, right? And let's talk about race and the priesthood. Let's talk about, these different things. It's an expanded gospel topics essay. And this newest one to come out that Simon's talking about is about Let's Talk About DNA. And you can pre-order it from Deseret Book. It's about $14.
Advertising from Deseret Book.
Yeah, exactly.
I suspect that it will address the nuclear problem, not referring to nuclear energy or bombs or whatever, but it's because the essay doesn't. It's a gaping hole in their apologetics. Right.
What can it say, though? What can it say to address it? I mean, you've explained it so clearly. This nuclear DNA does
it'll
not
be
lie.
along the lines of, we just haven't dug up enough cities yet.
There's always something. The goalpost, it's out there. We just don't
10
know.
years from now, when when DNA is 100 times better than it is today, they'll still say, "Oh, then we just need to go a little deeper." That's where why we haven't found it yet.
Yeah, I think it's also just sort of a salvage operation. I think there are certainly some apologists in their heart of hearts know that the church it's not historical. You can really, I mean, pretty sure Terrell Givens and Bushman and a couple of the others and know that there are very strong suggestions that it's historical. It's not historical, and it's a story that was invented in the 1800s. But the apologists are basically it's just they put up lines of defense. And so, for people that don't understand science very well, they'll happily accept.
Exactly.
There could be lots and lots of cities where these people live, but their descendants, these people in all of these cities have descendants that have moved around the country. That's why these cities disappear. Their descendants move somewhere else. That's what human populations do. When things dry up, they don't just all sit there and, I'm just going to die here, thanks very much.
No, they get up and
gradually
go.
shift away to places where they can get water and where they can get food.
But you're not wrong. I mean, all they have to do is keep putting out this scientific material. And I hear this all the time. Oh, smarter people than me have figured it out. DNA is okay. I'm not going to worry about it. Smarter people than me have figured it out. Archaeological evidence, I don't need to worry about it. I'm certainly not going to lose my testimony over it, right? Would I want to step away now when maybe a year from now they're going to discover something? So it's just this, kick the can down the road kind of a thing. And the apologists that, they just have to use all the big words and the right terms, and people trust that. So, I mean, this has been going on for, how long? I remember my parents were so into farms, the ancient research, and there were firesides that were given, people coming in. Everything they said back then has been completely debunked. But if you really look at what most of the faithful LDS people are saying, is that stuff is that, but it's really faith that tells you the Book of Mormon is true. It's really the spirit. That's all they can really rely on. Put all the rest of that somewhere else. It'll sort itself out someday. How do you feel? It's very interesting to watch.
Yeah, but it didn't stop the Mormon missionaries from using, when we were investigating the church back in 1970, it didn't stop the Mormon missionaries using pictures of South American civilizations and showing temples that looked, and there were 12 temples, and there's a font here. Oh, it looks like a font. Must be a baptismal font. All this sort of
stuff. It
held
water, so it must be baptismal font.
They used evidence to get us into the church.
Yep.
And then to turn around and say, well, no, you can't use evidence to think about the evidence that got you into the church.
Well, they still do those tours of Book of Mormon land, right? And they still have those people, the guides that go out there and tell a completely false history, completely appropriate what's really there and tell this false history. And those tours are still widely attended. So,
well, I'm perfectly comfortable with people holding those beliefs. I've got loved ones who still hold those beliefs.
Yeah, I do too.
I just respond to the critics, the apologists, the BYU apologists, the limited geography apologists, and the Heartland pseudoscientists when they twist science. And I just want to get the science out there so people can make their own choice. If somebody if they want to accept the apologetics, fine. But if somebody doesn't accept the apologetics, that's got nothing to do with their worthiness. They're still a good person. But they've just discovered that the Book of Mormon isn't history. So the church needs to break this link between somebody who doesn't believe that it's history and talking about that and somebody's worthiness. Because if you go along to church and you start talking about how the Book of Mormon isn't history, you'll have a bishop hauling you into his office and asking him to shut up.
Yeah. But more and more people feel that way.
discipline.
I mean, I follow faithful social media, and a lot of them are like, I don't really believe it's historical, but I believe in the church. They're able to make this disconnect somehow. And they pointed out it's not in the temple recommend question. Do you believe, you have to believe the prophet, but you don't have to believe in the Book of Mormon, or it's not in the baptismal question. I can't remember. It was one or the other. So I think they're realizing that the church seems to be able to let people have a wide range of beliefs as long as you still sit there in the pew and you pay your tithing. And in fact, when asked about Book of Mormon geography, they say, we hold no position and we don't want you guys to talk about it or to promote it. We hold no position as to where it is. That means you can believe whatever you want as long as you attend and don't make a big issue of it. So it's fascinating.
I don't think we're at the point where somebody can talk about this openly.
I agree.
As not being historical at church.
Yeah. Oh, no, they couldn't. But President Nelson has said things like, this is not supposed to be a history textbook, right? So they have dropped little nuggets like that, and they do focus on feelings around it. But there is no real way around it. It must be literal or everything crumbles if you really analyze it. But a lot of people are trying to see it as allegorical, good lessons, good feelings. But if you dissect that, it all crumbles.
But I think Simon's right. If you say it's historical, no problem. You can say that all you want. If you say it's not historical, you've got a problem with your church leaders. You can't come out in Sunday school and say this. We know this book isn't historical. Everyone would lose their crap in Sunday school. But you can say it's historical, and everyone will back you up. So you can't really look at the science and then come out and say, we all know it. That doesn't carry the day.
The Community of Christ, formerly the Reorgs, they've managed to traverse that territory reasonably effectively. I mean, they did lose a lot of members, and they're probably not growing very much, but they're no different to the Mormon Church now, because the Mormon Church isn't growing. Exactly. It's declining. But I don't know, 30 years ago, they sort of dropped the historicity of the Book of Mormon. You can be a Community of Christ member and just believe that it's inspired fiction. The trouble for the Mormon Church, though, is because they pin so many things on the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon that if you start saying it's a inspired fiction, then a lot of people just think, well, boom, everything goes with that.
Yeah.
But
I think their answer.
How can somebody be a prophet of God?
Exactly. I think their answer is maybe lies in. We did an episode just the other day that I think we will have aired by this one, talking about translations of the Book of Mormon into other languages are only certain sections. This has been going on in the past where Book of Mormon's, handed out and preached from are only certain sections. Things are left out. Same in seminary. You're not reading the entire Book of Mormon. You're reading certain verses, not like when we were there. Come follow me, cherry pick certain things. So where they used to tell you to read it cover to cover, it seems like now they're really curating what you do read. So maybe that's kind of an answer. Maybe eventually no one will really know what's in it and then it won't be so problematic. Oh.
Well, I think eventually they'll get there, but it's just a balancing act. The church knows to get there, we've got to do all of these things. And each one of these things is going to impact the membership, and it's better to drip feed it, raise the temperature of the water slowly so the frog doesn't leap out and they stay in there. And that's what they're doing. So that's what the apologists are really doing, is just delaying the inevitable, helping the church to survive. But I would argue they're probably at a point where they might as well address it, because they're losing members left, right, and center anyway.
Well, their answer to that is to dial up the second coming rhetoric, right? Which is off the charts now. So forget about all this stuff, the science, whatever you're concerned about. Jesus is coming, and you better be right with God right now, because
don't look at the past, look at the future.
You don't want to worry about
looking
DNA.
at the future.
No, it's absolutely true. When they're losing their grip, losing control, and people are questioning, Jesus is coming, right? So don't worry about all that. That'll work itself out. You got to get yourself right. And I see this over and over, and it works. It works on people. So fear mongering is how you combat science, I think. Yeah, well, this has been absolutely fascinating. Landon, do you have any final thoughts on this? I just love it. We've heard it right from the expert here, and I think we already all knew, but now we really know.
Yeah, I just think, there's really two topics that just can not be argued by the LDS, and that's the Book of Abraham and the DNA. Yep. And they're both just so overpowering, and the DNA just gets more and more and more exact. And they not only do they have to worry about the DNA of humans, they have to worry about the DNA of plants and animals that they say were here, and the DNA clearly is showing that those weren't here. So again, everything leads to not historical. If these plants really existed, the DNA would show they existed here in the Americas at that time, and it clearly shows that they came from Europe. And so you can't say that the DNA of every animal, every plant, every human that has a Nephite connection just disappeared. It's not even plausible.
And God, everything is possible. That's what they say. God has lifted it up.
God can hide it, but then what kind of God is that he's trying to trick you?
He's testing your faith, Landon. That's what
I love the DNA because it's just so, and the more accurate it gets, the more deadly it is to the Book of Mormon's claims.
Well, I'll tell you one more little anecdote. The first apologetic response to DNA was written by John Sorensen when he was at Farms, and he was basically he controlled everything. He was very, very influential, and he read an article in the Hawaii magazine, and he interpreted the article in such a way that he believed that it proved that there was a strong genetic link between Polynesians and Native Americans. So he was very upbeat about DNA. He really thought it was good. Then the very same scientist published some human DNA research that talked about Eve living 200,000 years ago. Oh. And he suddenly hated DNA science, and he ridiculed the DNA science. And that was in the same year. So it's just later that year that John Sorensen published that. So this is Rebecca Cann at the University of Hawaii. And ironically, because Sorensen passionately believed the Polynesians were descended from Book of Mormon people, partially because he served his mission in French Polynesia. Oh. And when Thor Heyerdahl sailed his raft out into the Pacific, he was listening in to the radio calls from Kon-Tiki to the islands in the Pacific. So he wasn't actually on the island where Kon-Tiki landed, but it just proved to him, yes, they're related to Native Americans. And Thor Heyerdahl was just a popular scientist. He wasn't a scientist; he was a adventurer, really, and he just. But he was determined to prove that the ancestors of Polynesians. He was convinced Polynesians came from South America, and that's what drove his Kon-Tiki expedition. But the truth is, he had to be towed off the coast because the tricky winds on the coast. It's very hard to get out. But the Polynesians obviously had no problem getting off the coast of South America. But yeah, look, it's a troublesome piece of science that unfortunately, through no fault of the scientists at all, focuses in on a core claim of the Book of Mormon, and that core claim is American Indians have Hebrew ancestors who got there about 2,000 years ago. And the power, the technology we have these days can interrogate that claim in precise detail, and it's being done. That study in South America that I mentioned, where they've sequenced 350 genomes, as part of a Asia Genome 100,000 project. They've only just started. Okay, so there'll be tens of thousands of genomes of American Indians that will have been studied. And the reason they're doing this is mainly for medical reasons. The information they get tells you a lot about ancestry, but it tells you much more about a lot of human diseases. If you have the genomes of thousands and thousands of people, you can interrogate those genomes to find what causes this disease that Native Americans are more prone to getting, and this disease, and all that sort of stuff. So it's really good science with very, very noble objectives. But the data that it releases just so happens to be just perfectly suited to undermining the central claim of the Book of Mormon.
Dagger in the heart. And again, these scientists are not trying to prove anything. They're trying to see what's there, which is how you do science, right? Simplistically. You're not starting with the conclusion, like the Mulestein thing where he says, I start with the idea that it's true and then I work to prove. No, they're not doing that at all. So yeah, it's fascinating. And I love the idea that more and more will be coming out, and again, the apologists will have to spin and spin and scramble and scramble. And it's funny you would bring up the Book of Abraham, Landon, because Simon made me think of that, where he said if they had discovered some of this DNA, for Israel, this would be a headline everywhere. This would be the hugest discovery everywhere. Book of Abraham, if that really was the hand of actual Abraham, that would be the world's greatest treasure and the biggest discovery. So all these things that Mormons just kind of implicitly believe, the world would know if this was something that was accurate. So it's important to shine light on all of this, though. Well, thank you, Simon, for coming on. This is great. Everybody, let me know in the comments. Let us know what are your thoughts on all this new research on DNA. I know it was a lot to unpack here. So if you have to watch this episode in increments, go ahead, but please watch the whole thing because it's really important. And as we talked about, our friends and relatives, faithful LDS, they believe something different, and they're going to kind of talk about the apologetics. I have friends and family that do that all the time. So it's good to be aware, not that you're going to argue with them, but you might introduce, want to read this article? I don't know if that would help at all, but let me know what you guys think in the comments. Please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware when the new episodes come out, you can hit that notification bell. If you'd like to help financially support the podcast, you can always make a donation. There are links to Donor Box. We're a nonprofit, and those are found in our show notes. And we appreciate everybody that does. Thank you all so much. We also have links to our merch store. You can grab a Mormonish mug or a hat or something. And thank you again, Landon, for co-hosting. Simon, thank you again so much. You're always a excellent guest with so much awesome knowledge, and we will see everybody next time on Mormonish. Thanks, everybody.
See ya.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.